Hello everyone, Kurt Holfeder here, and welcome back to another episode from Holfeder Labs. Today we continue on with Fiore's works, and we are going to be focusing on what I think is the sword theory, in which he has for not just for swords in two hands, but also for all long arm combat that will follow in these sections. Now I want to be clear about what I mean by that is that there's only a paragraph right here before he starts going into the 6 dissimilar guards. But before he goes into that, he has this blurb, this paragraph of information right here where he starts to explain basics of guard works right here, and he has some images that are going to be working off of where he references to kind of to convey his point. And I'm going to talk a lot about that today. This is not necessarily a demonstrational one. You'll be seeing some footage here and some images as well. But this is much more of a discussion point that's going to be happening here in regards to this portion of the manuscript, because this right here means that essentially all positions, all plays, whether it be with a sword, a lance, or an axe, later on from this point on, this theory is going to carry forward. And in following videos, you're going to understand a little bit more here, because I don't think that the sword is just about sword fighting. The sword is the trainer for other knightly arms, and that'll be conveyed in other videos in the future. But for right now, I'm going to read off this right here. And again, I'm using the Flowers of Battle, Volume 1. It's translated by Tom Leone and Greg Melee. It's also, they have the historical overview in regards to the context of time. Highly recommend it if you don't have it already. It's fantastic. So I'm going to read this section right here that they've translated from above, and then I'm going to discuss a little bit more about that theory. So, we are two guards, and we are alike but contrary to one another. As with other guards in this art, alike guards are contrary to one another, with the exception of point guards, posta longa, breve, and mezza porta di ferro. With a point guard against point guard, the most extended guard can reach the opponent first. Anyway, what one guard can do, its opposite also can do. These guards can perform a volta stabile and a mezza volta. A volta stabile lets you play forward and backwards from one side only, without moving your feet. A mezza volta is when you pass forward or backwards, so you play on the opposite side, forward or backwards. A tutta volta is when you use one foot to describe a circle around the other foot. In other words, one foot stays in place and the other two circles around it. The sword can also do these three movements: volta stabile, mezza volta, and tutta volta. These two guards are both posti di donna. There are four more contrary concepts in this art, which is passing forward, passing backwards, stepping forward with the front foot, and pulling back with the front foot. So these right here are essentially the footwork concepts and the turn work, everything else that we've been talking up until this point that lay out a lot of what he is saying with the sword. So before we go into everything else with this right here, I want to talk about this. I'm going to break this down line by line. And as you're going to see right here, the image that they have with this, you see two positions that he states right off the bat here, and they're both contrary to one another. And that, when he talks about with all guards like this, what one guard can do, the other can do. And if they are like guards with each other, they can play they can play as they would with each other. The exception of this is your long points, where the sword is in the center of the body here, where the longest position hits the person first. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. For right now, I want to talk a little bit about contrary and opposing. These are, contrary and mirrored. You'll hear me talk about this, and the reason why I talk about this right here is because many of the positions in which Fiore has, he is constantly, in my opinion, either once again, going back to his advice that he says in the very, very beginning with Abbracciare, which essentially is, once again, look at the person across from you, assess their strengths and their weaknesses, assess your strengths and weaknesses. Do they take up the position of Abbracciare, etc. This is also very much so carries over into this play. So because these two images right here are one and the same, they are the same thing right here. They look right, both situations, the left foot is forward with the sword on the right side, whether it be high or low. It doesn't necessarily matter. Those are opposing structures. So if someone is to pass in with this and make a strike, then once again, you are still opposed. And we're going to talk about how these footwork concepts right here make a big part of all the things which Fiore is trying to say out of this, because ultimately, all crossings, in my opinion, are based upon how you enter, whether it be contrary or mirrored. Now, deductive reasoning wise here, and again, you'll probably see the footage right here with Connor and I doing back and forth with this. Again, if in these two positions right here, which are posta di donna, with the sword on the right shoulder, if these two positions right here are contrary or opposing to one another, then that means, by deductive reasoning, if I take a mirrored position, the result is different. So in this case, if I take a posta di donna sinistra, then what ends up happening here is that we have a different type of striking pattern that doesn't create binds, but it creates breaks. And that is a big part of what I think Fiore is saying right here in this very, very, very first portion of it all. It's not about what position beats what position. It's ultimately understand basic theory of everything we've been talking about up to this point. Opposing/contrary positions, so same guard positions. So people in tutto porte ferro or in posta di donna, both in the same position. The sword, if I had my posta di donna on my right shoulder right here, then the sword is going to appear on my left side in that other person, even though they're carrying it on their right. As we shift and move, as the video shows, we are going to create a position that once again locks up and creates a bind. Now, that is a very important thing that comes to this, because ultimately, when it comes down to the sword, the four things we can do with it is strike the person, cover, bind, or break. So that's a big part that I think he's trying to convey here with this first portion. By deductive reasoning, I can look at this and say, okay, well, if I take up the left side, where now my sword is on my left shoulder and it's in the same plane, and if they take up the right guard, I'm now in a spot where our blades, if we do strike together, we create a break and we get behind the blow. The universal parry that Fiore talks about so much right here is just using a false edge strike against somebody to beat the sword to one side, which is a big part of what I think his process is. Don't fight strong if you don't have to, or if you feel like you can dominate there, take the dominant space there. So that's the very, very first portion of all, and I find the wisdom of that. It's not spelled out like an academic book. It is meant to be put out there for you to think and contemplate on, which is what makes this so important. Interesting enough, once again, we see the turns of the feet and the turns of the sword. And if you saw the videos before, again, that is just, once again, how we can shift and make the sword work here. It's anatomy. All times right here, we are always attacking the abrazare positioning. As we make positions, and we'll talk about that here later on when you start going to the posta, the guardia, you'll see how, once again, the positions and everything else kind of go together in a form of fashion that make, in my opinion, the shapes of abrazare guards. And because of that, because we're connected to something, we have something connecting us in a different position, that changes what the core position of abrazare is, because you have something here, how you turn it around and they make a different shape. That's a big part about this. It's also necessary. So all the movements we did before have to convey across into this, because now we have extension in that point. The longer sword reaches the other person. And again, that to me that's a part right there. Once again, Fiore is just making commentary of, understand that a person with a long sword, they can reach you first. But also, you can play on the inside because of plays you've had elsewhere here. So again, it's just a commentary of technology and everything else. And we'll see that with different swords within this section. Big part about that, huge part to pay attention to, okay? That's the big portions right there when it comes down to it. So because we have the basic concepts of, if we have a light guard by light guard, we have an opposing structure. If we have a position that mirrors one another, that means that essentially our sword, so again, if I'm on the left side, my sword is on my left side here, I'm seeing them in a right guard, our swords are on the same spot, we're going to create a break. That's the other part about that. Now, he says volta stabile and mezza volta. In this right here, when we make different types of crossings, this is also a spot right here that create different ways of being able to enter. It's not complicated in the regards of, what is the tactical solution. If we wanted the tactical solution, we would need Fiore there to talk to us and look at the buy type right here. Much like what Talhofer talks about as a maestro at arms. Look at the person right here. If you're assessing to try to teach somebody, look at the person, see what their strengths and weaknesses are, and how you can assess and try and strengthen them. Not any different in how you size up a fighter. So going into Fiore, I do think that he would have done the same thing. We can't look at this right here and say, he wants us to fight this way. No. He wants us to see that this is the algorithm of combat. And ultimately, all possible outcomes right here are what are beneficial in combat are presented thusly. So why is there volta stabile and mezza volta right here? Well, again, as you can see as the passing right here goes, A mesovolta to mesovolta here on the same guard position allows us to basically make crossings into opposing structures, but it also might mean that we are choosing to circle around into a position that allows us different ways to bind and create different actions. If I use volta stabile, however, and just play forward and back with this, and a crescimento with this, again, the same footwork, I can beat the terminal strength position of the sword and win in the center line position differently. It doesn't make it right or wrong. And personally, and I know this may not be a popular theory when it comes down to Lichtenauer and whatnot, I think that's all he's trying to say with the whole Zornhau, Zorn-Ort thing, is that basically utilize and either step into the blow or step wide to the blow. And all you are doing here is, again, creating space that allows you to fight in different ways. It's not about good or bad. It's about observation of the fighter. If you're trying to beat a fighter that's bigger than you and you want to put yourself in an opposing structure, you're probably going to get trucked unless you know how to do grappling and other pieces right here. And that might be the game in which you're trying to set up within this art of arms. That's the first portion of that right there. Ultimately, you can see the same thing is also achievable in mirrored structures. So in the mirrored structures here, and again, the only examples I use for this video is posta di donna against posta di donna sinistra. And both of those right there are showing how, once again, as a person is passing and moving forward in different directions here, as you can see, Connor is just using, once again, that basic mesovolta strike, where he'll pass forward onto the other side of plane, where he's going to try to cut that fendente line, right? Ultimately, right here is, as he does this, all I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing, which allows me to fall behind the sword to break into a thrusting avenue, which allows me to control the momentum of the center and put my point on line. For that position, I can either do a mesovolta, or I can choose to do a volta stabile. In both scenarios, it just sets up different body structures. And that's where all the lessons of the lines we've had before within the dagger section are so incredibly important here. So essentially what this position right here is teaching, and again, this is what I glean from it. I'm very curious to see what people have to say about this, but ultimately right here, this is just rule of combat. And that is right here is that you can do this or you can do this. And when I say this and this, so you can either break against, you can either choose a bind by using mesovolta, you can bind by stepping onto the inside. A sword that's longer than the other is going to strike first. And ultimately, if you have an opposing structure, or as he says, a contrary structure, which are synonymous, I find, then you are going to basically, what one guard can do to the other is what one guard can do to the other. If we deduce from that, if we take away that concept, so what happens if they're mirrored to each other? Now, what happens when we put these in place? Why is that important? Because Fiore has left and right guards. He chooses to play on both sides. It doesn't matter what side you're trying to play against. What matters is, ultimately, what line and avenue do you want to use to enter in on somebody? And that's the point and premise in which he's trying to drive at here. So this, the section right here, that is what this first portion right here, when it comes down to the sword in two hands. And I think it's a very, very, very important piece of it all, because it doesn't tell us how to fight. It just tells us laws and rules and facts that happen within the structural concept of a fight. And essentially with that right there, again, whether it's a high guard or a low guard, as you saw, Connor and I are both sitting there, it doesn't matter. If we're both on the right side and we're just choosing to utilize the basic premise, we're not even talking about the rules of guards yet, the basic premise of where you're going to be striking out of, then we might find these rules to be very applicable. Of course, dear viewers, when we get to guards, you're going to see how some of them, just because I'm in posta di donna does not mean I'm just going to throw a right fendente. It doesn't mean that at all, and we'll talk about that. But this is just talking about the rules and statuses when it comes down to what's happening here as the general concept. Off of that general concept, we start to break that into further things within the manuscript, and that's the part that I find absolutely fascinating. So with that being the case here, that's going to wrap up the video here. Again, this is a commentary video right here. It was not a demonstration portion of how to take these positions here, but I find this very important here because these rules that he puts out to us is a common core value of how to fight in general with these concepts. And then we can find ways to break these algorithms by adding things in there in different forms and fashions. By having the base equation right here and being able to sub them out with different posta, different guards, different footwork, we find different ways to make the crossings and other tactical considerations that we may have to face in the future, which is how I think the Fiore is trying to convey this portion of his manuscript. And this will also be very present when we start talking about the crossings of the sword and what happens there. So for right now, that's what I said. That's going to do for the video here. Please leave a comment below here. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on this right here. I'm excited to get into the sword in two-hand because to me, it is a very, very, very complicated by design thing to try to understand. However, Fiore, in my opinion, makes it very easy to understand because he's not teaching you how to fight. He's teaching you algorithmic concepts of what happens at certain points. And if we look at it that way, then we can teach people what to do in spaces and how to use those type of areas to our advantage, because it's not about doing the play. It's about you fighting for yourself and you being able to fight in what works for you. And that's what I love about this manuscript. It's not about trying to say, oh, I didn't do the technique right. No, it's about what works for you in the concept of art of arms. So leave a comment below. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear it as we go forward with this. If you're new to the channel, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing with a friend out there. I want to grow this channel as much as possible, and that's not possible without viewers like you. I'm very appreciative of all the comments that come in. Please join us on this adventure of the 14th century of arms of Fiori. And again, to all my viewers out there, thank you so much for stopping by. And as always, please stay safe out there, train well, and fight on. I will see you all soon.